Okay, hello everybody. My name is Abby Adams. I am a librarian with the University of Albany. So today I'm going to briefly go over a game that I designed to help do a better job of teaching students to recognize and deal with mis and disinformation. It's kind of been a perennial problem, and we keep trying to find new and better solutions. So here's one that I've hit on. I'm going to go over a little bit of how I developed the game, why I developed the game, the pedagogy and the research behind it. Run through a fairly detailed overview of the game elements themselves. Usually, in conference presentations, I have people actually play it, but given the time constraints here, I'm just going to kind of run through some of the elements and describe it. And then I'm going to talk about the results of how it went as compared to the more traditional lecture teaching style that I usually get asked to do in classes, and then where I'm going next with it. My practice session clocked in at about 23 minutes, so hopefully we'll have time for plenty of questions at the end if anybody has any. So here are some of the challenges that I was hoping to address. Information literacy skills, those recognizing good resources on the internet, finding resources on the internet, determining whether something is reliable or not. Um, it's a really important life skill, and it's one that a lot of students aren't very interested in developing. So we try to go into classrooms and we try to teach it and we try to explain, here's how to use the library, or here's what a peer-reviewed article is. And one of the big issues is that students see this as an academic skill. This is something they need to understand just enough of to get an A on their paper or to pass their class, and then they forget it all and move on. And they don't make that jump from this is something I learned in class to this is something that I can actually use in my everyday real life. There's also an issue with low engagement in classes, especially courses that I tend to go into. I'm the subject librarian for Homeland Security, emergency preparedness, criminal justice. So it tends to be fairly heavy subject matter. And so any real world examples I use are often kind of upsetting to people. So students don't necessarily want to engage in topics that they're afraid of what their peers might think of their opinion on. They don't want to look like they're uninformed about current events. And so if I was using real examples, they would just shut down, not engage at all. So I knew I had to deal with that. There's also a challenge of a lot of people know that they should fact check. They want to fact check, but they don't quite know how. And there are people on the internet that know that and they take advantage of that. You see this a lot, especially like in the field of psychology. You'll see a lot of people on TikTok right now talking about PTSD or autism or ADHD. And sometimes they know what they're talking about, and sometimes they're 14-year-olds with an opinion. We get that a lot with information literacy terminology as well. People deliberately, maliciously using some of those same terms and using them in a way that sounds convincing, but they're trying to deceive people. And then there's an issue where sometimes people just don't care if information is accurate or not because they see that it's useful to them. It'll drive engagement on social media. It'll make their friends laugh. They assume that their followers will know that it's fake. They just don't really care. So I wanted to help address some of this because I felt like my teaching as it was just not touching a lot of these troubles. So I went and I did a whole bunch of reading. Um, what I found were some alternate approaches to information literacy that have been effective for other people. Probably the biggest one was that people don't like to be lectured to. What I'm doing right now is not super effective. And we know that kind of across the board. But people think in narrative arcs. They remember stories. So if I give them kind of dry real world examples, they may or not remember, may or may not remember. But if I give them a good narrative, that's far more likely to stick in their head. One way to do that is to use fiction. It gets away from the politicized topics, the uncomfortable topics, the violent topics, issues in the news like that. I have a coworker who she uses Star Wars examples, and those tend to go over really well. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy or complex, just something that kind of breaks away from real life and things that students are a little bit reluctant to engage on. Or if you don't like the fiction model, you can also connect to something that's real, that's already of interest to students, but that they don't register as being academic. And ASU's Taylor Swift class definitely made the news last year. I think that was a social psychology class. And a lot of people were talking about how this is, the death of academia and stuff. It's, I think, a brilliant approach, though. It takes something that students care about that they can apply to their real life. It's already bridging that gap between what is academic and what is real. And it's saying, hey, these skills that you're learning in school, they can be applied anywhere. So that's another really good approach. There's also gamification, and there are a lot of options with that. And there are also a lot of pretty well-researched, well-publicized pitfalls. It takes a lot of time. Sometimes you can get too focused on the game and not focused enough on the learning. Some classes like cooperative, some like competitive, so you kind of need to cater to your audience a little bit. But when it's done well, gamification can be really, really effective. And the caveat to all of this, sometimes students just want lectures. They may not be learning from the lectures, but if you deviate from that at all, they're going to say that you're making them teach themselves, that the class is a waste of time. Statistically, that is a minority, though, of students, both from my research and my own experience, is that most of them favor the stories and the active learning. I also learned about inoculation theory, which says that, okay, if disinformation, if bad information is spreading on the internet like a virus, can we treat it like a virus and inoculate against it? Can we make a vaccine? So instead of always running behind and fact checking, can we teach people to recognize the red flags of what general misinformation or disinformation looks like before they encounter it so that they recognize it and don't buy into something that's false? This is still a comparatively new theory. There's still a lot of testing being done on this, but it seems that, yeah, it's actually pretty effective. So I took all of my readings together and I decided, okay, I like the gamification angle and I like the fiction angle. So I'm going to build a game that incorporates active learning, that gets the students to engage, to actually practice some of these real world skills, um, that lets them fail in a way that is more funny than scary to them. It makes it very low stakes, but it also kind of helps cement in your memory, I was wrong about this and I learned. So I opted for the fiction versus something that was real. That was more of just my own preference for what I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that it was well founded on inoculation theory and that I was actually teaching directly transferable real world skills, versus a game that was a little bit harder to apply. And so I could say, like, oh, see how this works. I needed kind of a direct one to one. And then I landed on werewolves as how I was going to do this. Again, some of this is my own preference, but I did have reasons for this choice. First is that they're very recognizable. Everybody knows what a werewolf is for the most part. I do explain very, very briefly at the beginning of class, like, here's how this works, within the game. But it's not something that I have to go into a lot of detail on. It's something that's removed enough from any kind of real world scenario that it's obviously very playful. Students tend to find it amusing. And it also poses a very clear and easy threat within the game of I can say, okay, this is a shape-shifting monster. They can look like people, which means they have the capacity and the interest in lying to you, but also they want to eat you. So that gives me a pretty good starting point with students of saying, okay, we're going to play a game and it's going to teach you some of these lessons. So I'm going to show you quickly how I set up the game, what the components look like, how I run through it with students. Um, the frame that I set up with them is, I tell them that we're playing a game, that it's meant to teach how to recognize misinformation, how to learn kind of the red and green flags of what to look for. And I say there are reports of a werewolf on campus. We don't know if these reports are true or not. It's up to you to figure this out. Within the game, werewolves are real. Werewolves eat people. These aren't up for dispute. So nobody has to derail on, are they sexy and misunderstood? No, they're just monsters for purposes of the game. Whatever you know about any outside werewolf lore is irrelevant. If you don't like horror, that's fine. This isn't actually a horror game. It's just the frame that we're using. But then I tell them, so there's a lot of conflicting information going around because the werewolves, they want an easy meal, so they're lying. There are people that are out there that are trying to produce helpful information, but they don't know what they're talking about. And so they're accidentally spreading some of that disinformation or they're garbling things and they're passing along information that's not useful. And then there are some people that are passing along good information, relevant information that's going to tell you how do you recognize a werewolf, how do you protect yourself from a werewolf. And so right now I have physical packets. There's 8 sources in the packets. I have the students get into groups and I tell them, talk this out because in the real world, when there's something new that we're all talking about, everybody talks to their friends and their family about it. You don't make these decisions in a vacuum. And they definitely sway each other, which is very interesting for me to watch. Sometimes I will have a fairly strong personality that gets very convinced of something and they will talk the rest of their table into it. So I can incorporate that into the lesson as well. But I have them get into groups, I pass out the physical sources, and then I tell them, okay, you have a lot of these skills already. So use what you know about how do you recognize reliable information on the internet, pretend all these sources are online, and figure out what's true. The game itself runs 15 to 25 minutes. It kind of varies based on class size. Some of them figure it out fairly quickly, some of them never figure it out, some of them get bored. So I kind of play that part by ear. But I have this listing here, as shown on my screen, saying, okay, within the 8 sources that I'm going to go through in a second, there are 8 possible indicators of how do you recognize a werewolf. Only some of them are true. You don't know how many are true, and that they don't like. They want me to tell them exactly how many they're looking for. And I always say, in the real world, you don't know. That's part of it. Can you figure it out? And then there's a QR code. So if they think they have the answer, they can test themselves before the end. Um, if they don't want to kind of commit to what the answer is, they don't have to. So that again keeps it low stakes for the students, helps them engage without necessarily feeling embarrassed or feeling pressured. Then after the game itself, I run through each of the sources and I go step by step as to here is why this was a red flag or a green flag. And a lot of times they're right. They do figure it out, but they can't articulate why, which is, I think, interesting. And so when I go through and point out, here are all these subtle little things that you're picking up that you recognize in the real world too, then they can take that and apply it later on. The source evaluation part, this is also research based. When I was doing a lot of reading into gamification, that's what it indicated was that if you have the students do the active learning component and play the game, and then you have an instructional session afterwards, it kind of cements it and it helps pull in people who think differently and learn differently, and it makes sure that everybody is on board. This discussion is usually pretty interactive because the students have just spent 20 minutes reading through the sources and talking to each other, so they're a lot more warmed up. They're far more likely to engage with me at that point. So I'm going to run through the actual sources themselves that the students go through in the game and kind of do the same breakdown that I do for them at the end. So there are 4 sources in the packet of 8 that are misinformation. So these are all ones that I tell the student afterwards are created by people that are trying to be helpful and just don't really know what they're talking about. So the first one, this is probably my favorite. This is just a wildly dramatic infographic. And there's no real context to it, which is part of it. I tell them we have no idea who the source is. There's no date. We don't know what's going on. The claims are really, really broad. This one usually gets them accusing each other of being werewolves. So again, it kind of gets things to be a little bit more playful. I've been accused of being a werewolf. They have fun with this one. But we can also talk about how, in the real world, this stuff comes up all the time. All of these are based on actual real sources on things like COVID and climate change, gun control, all of the real issues where people aren't sure how to find good information on. So we talk about the inflammatory language. We talk about claims that are too broad to be particularly useful. We talk about questionable sources. Next one is a blog that pairs with the infographic, and the .org throws a lot of people off. There's still definitely a sense among students that .com things are kind of questionable and .orgs are just rock solid. They're up there with the .gov, and the .edu is a domain that you can believe. So I usually have to talk for a little bit about that. But we talk about kind of how to delve into a website, how to figure out where's their funding coming from, who are they, what are their credentials. Again, we look at the dramatic language and we talk about how this isn't just 100%. There are good sources and there are bad sources, because that's not really how the real world works. There are more reliable and less reliable. And so if you've got kind of a mixed bag like this, you kind of have to treat the whole thing as being less reliable because you're not sure which parts are accurate and which parts aren't. Then I've got a coupon. This usually just makes people laugh. Where the garlic sellers here within my little fiction, they don't care if garlic repels werewolves or not. They're just interested in making money. And then I've got an email. This is our actual presidential template, so the students at Albany recognize this, but it's too old. And there's usually at least one person within a group that catches that. And then they have a nice discussion about dates, which I appreciate. This is one that sticks in their heads, definitely, the check if this is too old. I did have one class completely derail on how this was a fake phishing email, which was interesting. So I've had to make some changes to this over time. I have one source that is entirely disinformation. This one is created by the werewolves within the fiction. And I have a lot of little indicators here. A lot of them are fairly subtle. This is the one that definitely fools students the most. And this tends to be the one where somebody in the group will be convinced that it's real and they will talk all the rest of them into believing it. So like I said, that always gives me kind of a good opening. I walk around the class as they're playing so I can hear what they're all saying to each other. This definitely gives me a lot to talk about. Probably the biggest one here, the biggest indicator is that they are entirely in-house. All of their references are to themselves, and their overall vibe is listen to us because we're smarter than everybody else. And so I tell them, any of these one little red flags on their own isn't necessarily going to be an indicator of disinformation or malicious intent, but taken all together, this is a really sketchy source. And this is also the place where a lot of them kind of have that gut instinct of something's off, but I don't know what. And so actually talking through this can be really, really helpful to students. Then I've got my Reddit thread. This used to be a Twitter feed, and they ignored it entirely. They were all like, yeah, it's Twitter. It's all lies. They paid zero attention. And then when Twitter turned into X and it was kind of collapsing, I switched it to Reddit, and they're far more likely to believe the Reddit thread, which is interesting to me. So I've got a werewolf as the original poster, and then a couple people who were trying to be helpful, and then an ad. So this one's a mixed bag. This one also generates a lot of talk among the students. And then two of my sources in that packet are reliable. The final two, I've got a newspaper article that corresponds to the local paper. So again, I have all of the kind of green flags here of here are positive indicators that are something that's going to be, this is probably a reliable source. This is something that's going to be fairly useful to me. And then finally, my last one is I've got another infographic. Um, I like having the dual infographics, especially one as a just kind of off the wall and one as being like, this is absolutely the best source that you have, because it gets really far away from the peer-reviewed articles and the scholarly books that professors tend to focus on heavily. And for good reason, students need to know about that stuff. But that's part of why they don't make that jump from using reliable information in class to finding reliable information in real life, is because most people won't look up peer-reviewed articles, but they will watch TikTok videos or look at infographics online. And so they need to be able to apply those skills to things like infographics as well. So then when we're done, I give a little recap and we talk about things like confirmation bias in real life. We talk a little bit about AI. And then I've got this slide where they all pull out their phones and take a picture. But I use the acronym APPLY. And there's a lot of acronyms that talk about kind of the same, like how to run through your source checklist. There's the CRAP test, I've heard STAR. But this just gives me kind of that concluding point of here's everything that we just talked about, where you can look at how to determine whether something is more or less reliable and whether you want to use this for making decisions for yourself or for using it as a classroom source. So in 2022, I started this game and I played it with a whole bunch of different classes. And then I gave a whole bunch of other different classes, just kind of my standard issue lecture. And I tried to do a good job. I wanted all of them to learn. But I had all the classes take pre-tests and post-tests where I asked them to write down 5 indicators of unreliable information on the internet. Um, and then I compared them to determine is this game useful or not, or should I stick with the lecture? Should I try something else? Is this a good teaching tool? Essentially was what I was looking at. What I found is that engagement was vastly better with the game. Far fewer students would leave during the game. They were far better at answering the post test. I don't know if you can see very clearly on my slide here. The left blank is definitely the most dramatic column, where is about similar percentages between the lecture and the game classes as to how many students would leave answers blank when I asked for 5 indicators of misinformation. Some of them would leave all of it blank. Some of them would have 1 or 2. Far more students could answer all 5 and answer them accurately after playing the game. And then I went back at the end of the semester to all of those classes and I did a retention test. Um, and they had kind of leveled out. So the game was really good in the short term. It's not necessarily the only solution for long term. There needs to be more repetition. This would need to be reinforced with classroom learning. It doesn't stand alone as a one shot. I will say I've gotten a whole lot better at running this game, at explaining it, at doing kind of the recap with students afterwards. So I am curious to see the next time I start doing formal comparative testing, if there will be any changes, because I've learned a lot in both how to manage the game and just about disinformation. So the next steps here, checking my time. I've applied for a grant. A couple other librarians are on board, and we're working with Kansas State University. So we're trying to do kind of a national level expansion where we digitize everything. We're going to add in audio, visual, YouTube, TikTok, that kind of stuff. Allow like clickable links within the game. Build in more modules to allow for repetition. So hopefully that goes through. We'll see. Even if it doesn't, I'm still planning to pursue this just at a smaller scale. So I will be hoping at some point to expand out to involve more schools, more libraries, to make sure that this is stable beyond just me running the game. I want to do more rigorous comparative testing because my first round was good. I learned a lot, and I think there's enough potential to keep going with it. And even if, the grant falls apart and I have to move away from the game, I still learned a lot about how to make things more useful and more memorable for students. The first one being tell stories. So I've incorporated a lot of quick stories, quick narratives into even just my lectures. And those do tend to stick in their heads a little bit better. They'll mention it to me later, if they come to me 8 weeks later in the semester asking for help on something else. That's the part they remember. Um, I also make sure to pull away from some of the more politicized topics. They're very easy go-tos, you know, talking about COVID and stuff. They're tired of COVID. They don't want to talk about, the wars that are going on right now. So if I find examples that are more interesting, more fun, and far less political, those tend to drive engagement better. And I make sure that I don't just talk about academic sources because, again, they're important, they're necessary. I do talk about what scholarly sources are, I do talk about why they're useful, why they're necessary, but I also make sure to cover what are going to be other useful sources in class. So if you are looking for, um, you know, government information or data or social media information. So I teach more of the peer-reviewed article as a type of information and not kind of this is good and the rest is bad, even though that's all you're going to use in most of your actual non-academic life. So that's also been helpful just in making my lectures a little bit better, and in making my partnerships with professors better in terms of making sure that students learn what they need to learn and are able to apply it a little bit. If you are interested, once we send the slides out later, here is the published article in Public Services Quarterly. It came out in December. And then there's an open access version because it is behind a paywall unless you have, institutional access, and then my contact information. So, questions from anyone?
We don't have anything in the chat right now, but if anybody wants to unmute and ask their question directly, we can do that as well. Nancy has a question. Go ahead, Nancy.
Hi, thank you so much, Abby. That was really interesting. I work at SUNY Rockland Community College. I teach public speaking, but I also teach a social media class. So all of this is very relevant to information that my students are looking for. My question was the H sources that you shared with us, how do you share those with your students once you put them in groups? Is it just one PowerPoint that they all can see? Do you actually make hard copy or, how does each group access that information to talk about it?
Yeah, right now it's all in hard copy. So I have to update the dates every time I run this. And so I've got about 60 printed packets
Okay.
and they're just in manila envelopes and I hand them out. Depending on the class size, sometimes they have to share, sometimes I have enough for everybody. But yeah, that's part of why I want to digitize everything, to give them more options. They do like the hard copy actually. There's one of the classes that I run, it's a game design course. And so we also talk about the game design elements of it. And they were all surprisingly enthusiastic the last several semesters about having a physical game to play. And so their recommendation was have a hybrid game so that I can include the things like the TikToks and the YouTube videos that I want to add, but it still gives them something tangible, and an excuse to not just be distracted on their phone. So yeah, right now it's all a physical game that I print and hand out.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense to me because if they're all on their phone looking at the material, they do get very distracted. This way, hard copy, they're looking directly at what you want them to. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a couple more minutes. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Abby, can you put your contact information in the chat
Yeah.
in case somebody else has a question later? I know you had it on your first slide, I believe, for folks that may watch it later. Anyone else? Oh, well, Melissa's asking a question in the chat. What types of classes are these done in, Abby?
So I am the liaison librarian for that's the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity. And so it's mostly these classes. When I initially started the testing, I just emailed all the professors and said, "Can I experiment on your classes?" So it was kind of a mixed bag of whatever professors agreed. For the most part, I do this with the lower level undergrad classes. It tends to be sort of the introductory courses. I do a lot of the informatics classes where they're already talking a little bit about social media and online information. Those are the classes that tend to like me having coming back, even though I'm not currently doing the testing. So it's mostly what I have access to, which is part of why I want to expand this and see how it would play with classes that are outside of my own subject areas, and with somebody other than me running the game.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was very informative, and we're grateful that you joined us today. And we will see everyone at our next session. Thank you.
Thank you.